As you know, we've been talking about the pursuit of maturity. Because I've said that's why I'm involved in this work. And you say, why did Mary Ellen and I get up in the morning? Why would we be motivated to put forth the kind of energy and effort it takes to be involved with all of these schools? And it's because we long to see children grow up free and happy and healthy, with vital relationships with God, with self, with others, with ideas, with art and music and poetry and geometry and science. We long to see them grow up to maturity. We've been talking about the various stages of maturity, and I borrowed Jim Wilder's stages. I think he's got it right. There's the infant stage, and in the infant stage, the focus is learning to receive from others. And then the child stage, where we learn to take care of ourselves while being kind to others. The adult stage, where we learn to take care of two people simultaneously. In other words, I can take care of me, and I can do the rather complex task of taking care of another person, particularly if that other person gives off strange, effervescent kinds of signals that if you have a Y chromosome, you don't always understand. Today we've talked about those the last couple of times, and tonight I'd like to talk about parent maturity and elder maturity. To be a parent is to have the maturity level that would allow me to sacrificially take care of children, and an elder to sacrificially take care of the community. Now, a few things before we get into it. First, just a couple of quick reminders. What are some of the tasks of infant maturity? Learning to live in joy, learning to trust, to organize myself into a coherent personality, and that's done through imitating others. I learned to master my body. I learned to be peaceful. I mean, did you notice how well 4- and 5-year-olds are beginning to master their body? I learned how to rest, to go from a highly energized state to a calm state. The primary task at child level of maturity is to take care of myself while being kind to others. So I learn how to ask for what I need. I can pursue many different kinds of satisfactions. So I learn to enjoy many, many different things. I can take care of myself. I learn to take responsibility for myself, to ask for what I need. And then, again, to review, as an adult, I learned to take care of myself and another person simultaneously. I can remain emotionally stable in a difficult situation. In other words, when life gets stressful, I don't go into major brain dysfunction. I can contribute to the community and be consistent with who I am. All right. Let's move to what I would call for tonight precursors to parent and elder level maturity. In other words, if I'm going to function effectively as a parent, what has to be true about me? And the first thing, and this might be a little surprising, the first thing is I need to be a cup half full rather than a cup half empty person. I need to be, in other words, I have to have a positive orientation. Why in the world would that be important? And don't we know the difference? Don't we know the difference between the person who comes into the room and immediately sees what's wrong with everything and everybody, and that's their focus, versus the person who comes in the room and sees what's worth celebrating, what's worth being thankful for, what's good. And the level of joy one experiences correlates very highly with that orientation. There's about 25 years ago, I was first exposed to something that's called positive psychology. A guy by the name of Martin Seligman, who's a professor in Pennsylvania, a psychologist, looked around and he said, I think we've got this whole psychology thing wrong. Because what psychologists have started to do was the focus was on, quote, abnormal psychology. And we wanted to find out what was wrong with people and how we could make them average. Because if you're a scientist, you basically collect all the data and then you want it all to fit in a nice, normal distribution so that you can get kind of a good average of where people are supposed to be. And so what psychologists did is said, if there are people that don't fit, that they're not average, and we want to get them up to average. And what he began doing was, instead of studying that, he said, let's look at the people who seem to really do well in life, who report high levels of life satisfaction, who have good marriages, who are prosperous and fruitful, who seem to be happy and engaged and constructive in the way they do life. And instead of studying people that are sick, let's study people that are healthy and then ask, what makes them that way? And the field of positive psychology was born. And it's very interesting what they discovered. That if you raise somebody's general positive outlook, they will get what has in the fields become known as the happiness advantage. That a brain that is positively oriented, as opposed to negative, neutral, or stressed. So a brain that's joyful. I mean, it's good to be me here with you. A joyful brain actually functions 31% more productively than a brain that's negative, neutral, or stressed. That the research shows that a salesman who has a positive, joyful brain is 37% more effective in sales than someone with a negative, neutral, or stressed brain. That doctors who are positive are 19% faster and more accurate in diagnosis than a doctor with a brain that's negative, neutral, or stressed. And what positive psychology began to recognize is we've got the equation actually for success backwards, because we tend to think, if I'm successful, then I'll be happy. And of course the problem is that whatever success means, whatever the metric is, it keeps changing. So if a salesman meets their sales goals, new sales goals. If a businessman meets his revenue goals, new revenue goals. Always increasing. The goal keeps moving. And what these psychologists and researchers came to discover was that it's actually the other way around. That someone who is generally positive and happy, grateful and joyful, they're the ones that tend to be much more successful. And that's a little bit of a digression, but the reason I want to say it is because it's the joyful, happy parent that is far more effective. You see, if I have to choose between being in a joy state, good to be me here with you, versus being with an anxious state, and I'm just a little brain, which am I going to go to? Right? If I'm a little person, I want to attune with joyful, peaceful brains. And when I'm attuned with them, I can best learn, best grow, best thrive. I mean, often parents try to instruct their children when the parent themselves is in a low joy state. And that's the worst possible time to instruct your children. Because if I'm at a low joy state, one, I'm not really clear about what's happening around me. Because my brain's not functioning all that well. Increased emotional distress, decreased functioning of the frontal lobes of the brain. So the more emotional distress I'm experiencing, the less capable I am to really know what's going on and how to best respond. The second thing is little ones. Anyone around us, when we recognize a distressed brain, we don't trust it, and we don't learn from it very well. So, a precursor to effectively functioning at the parent level of maturity is that I stay at a high joy state. Now, obviously, all of us will experience emotional distress. So one of the secrets is to learn how to quickly recover from that emotional distress. Love, one of the things I discovered a while ago was that love and joy actually go very much hand in hand. That I cannot love someone effectively if I'm not in a high joy state. The reason is that the way we're wired is if I'm experiencing a high level of emotional distress, something's really gotten to me. I will always take care of myself first. That under duress, I take care of me. It's only when I feel strong enough to manage the situation in my own internal world that I'm free to actually care for another. I think that may be behind the Apostle John's thought in his first epistle, in which he says, we can only love because he first loved us. I think what John was saying there is that if you know that you're okay because God loves you, and it's well with your soul, then and only then is one freed up to really love others. I'll always take care of myself first until I know that I'm taken care of. And this is much more than just kind of external circumstances. This is in my own internal world. That if somehow I'm not doing life very well, I feel internally like my world is threatened. And I can tell that because my stomach's in knots, my pulse is racing, my muscles are tightening, my skin's tightening. If I'm not doing life very well, I will take care of me first. We're always fundamentally wired to be self-protective. Now, to be an effective parent, to function at a parent level of maturity, I need to move beyond that. I mean, because the whole job of being a parent is, I will take care of you. So we see how important this kind of positive, grateful orientation is, because the higher one's general level of positive gratefulness, the higher one's joy capacity and the more one lives in a kind of good to be me here with you state. A positive brain state makes loving relationships possible. And it's one of the interesting things about romance is romance puts us into the romantic phase of a relationship where suddenly all the flowers are beautiful and the sky is always blue, puts us into that joy-filled state when we can actually then very easily care for another. The struggle comes when we reach the point that what most marriages go through: romance, disillusionment, and then hopefully joy. That's the general three-stage progression. Once we realize that, this other person does have some flaws and is a little bit irritating at times. Once we get to that state, then we generally settle into what's our normal joy level. And if our normal joy level is low, then we're easily distressed. We easily go into brain dysfunction, and we find it difficult to remain in the brain state necessary to function at a parent level of maturity. So, first precursor to parent level maturity: positive brain orientation, or a high joy brain. Interestingly, the positive psychology people have developed a number of very simple skills for increasing positive brain orientation. Simple as every day stop and for 15 minutes every day, stop and write down 3 things you're grateful for that occurred that day. If someone does that for 21 days, their brain starts to scan for the positive, and they become increasingly more positively oriented. Most of us are trained to be negatively oriented. Most of us don't have what Charlotte Mason called the habit of sweet thoughts. Wouldn't that be a great gift to give your children? The habit of sweet thoughts, rather than the habit of what's wrong. The second precursor, it's something that psychologists call mind sight, and I talked a little bit about this last time. Mind sight is the capacity to be aware of what's happening in me and of what's happening in you. It's the capacity to know my own mind and to know your mind, as opposed to just being reactive. You probably realize that we all have a brain, and that brain is programmed to react in a certain way. Now, for most of the last 400 or 500 years, we've wanted to believe that the way it works is something like this, depending that we either have an idea and that leads to an action, or we have a desire and that leads to an action. Actually, what contemporary research shows is that we start to move in a certain direction to respond to the situation before we're even aware of a desire or of a thought about that situation. Someone walks through the door. I recognize them, and immediately I have a positive reaction because it's someone I know and trust and value. So a slight smile goes onto my face. My heart rate perhaps goes up a slight notch, but it's not stress. And a feeling of joy starts to develop within me. Now that all happens at least 0.3 of a second before I'm even aware that I'm positively predisposed to this person. I haven't had even any thoughts about this person yet. Depending upon who you listen to, we process, 10 to 20,000 times as much information unconsciously as we do consciously. So I've already started to react to any given situation long before, in terms of brain speed, long before I become aware of a desire or a thought about that situation. Somebody walks in the door and I don't like them, I'm already leveraged for a hostile response before I even had a thought or a desire regarding that person. Now, what difference does that make? Does that mean we're just robots and that we're just going to live out our programming? No. Because actually we've got about 0.3 seconds from the time we become aware before we actually do anything. And what we can do is we can redirect. So someone walks through the door and my immediate reaction is to frown. And I've already started to move in that direction. Before the frown goes across my face, I can say, wait. No, I'm going to move in a different direction. But to do that requires something called mind sight. That I'm actually aware of what's happening in me. This is the difference between what I consider to be bad marriage counseling and good marriage counseling. I have, as most of you know, my professional career has been as a counselor. I've had hundreds of married couples in my office. And I've also seen a lot of, call it bad Christian marriage counseling. Bad Christian marriage counseling looks something like this. Here's what the Bible says you're supposed to do. So, husband, you go do this, and wife, you go do this. And if you'll just obey it and do what I tell you, everything will be fine. Do you know, I've never seen that work. Because it doesn't look at heart reactions. What good marriage counseling does is it says, let's take a pause here. What's happening inside you when he does X, Y, or Z? What's happening inside of you when she does X, Y, and Z? And what is that about? And what's the dance the two of you do together that ends up getting you both in high degrees of pain? In other words, any real growth in relationship requires that we learn the art of mind sight, which means I become aware of what's happening in me. Because if I don't become aware of what's happening in me, I just react. And if you're in my counseling office, your reactions have not been very helpful to you or your spouse. And if we just react to our children, it's generally not very helpful to them. There is the pause that says, wait, right now I am in a lot of emotional distress over the fact that you just broke some treasure of mine. Well, if I'm in a high degree of emotional distress, I'm really not in a place to lovingly discipline you. So I need to call time out and deal with my own stuff before I deal with you. The way Jesus described it is he said, you really have to get the 2x4 out of your own eye before you try to take the splinter out of your child's eye. And to get the 2x4 out of our own eye is to practice mind sight. What's happening in me here? I mean, it is very interesting. If you were kind to Mother Teresa, you got love, joy, and peace. If you were unkind to Mother Teresa, you got love, joy, and peace. Because that's what she had cultivated within herself. Or she would say that's what God had cultivated in her. Mind sight pauses and says, what's happening inside of me? And does it have to be that way? And am I in a condition to respond lovingly to you? And if not, I probably need to call a little time out from myself. But that's only the first half of mind sight. The second half of mind sight allows me to ask the question, what's happening in you? I mean, it is amazing the way we can miss each other. The way we can respond really to our own stuff. It's in the pause that we find the freedom to move away from our worst self and towards our best self. The way the verbal logical explainer, or the left prefrontal cortex works, is it fabricates stories after the fact. In other words, so one of our children gets in trouble because it gets in distress because somehow they had a conflict with another classmate. And if you ask both classmates, it's interesting the stories they will develop. Because generally they're writing stories that will put themselves in the best possible light. I mean, isn't that what we do? I mean, think of the last time you had a conflict with your spouse. And when you start explaining it to yourself, we tend to explain it to ourselves in a way that puts us in the best possible light. Our verbal logical explainers do not naturally seek the truth. They seek to develop a story that puts us in the best possible light. That's what all of our natural tendencies are. The practice of mind sight is the pause that says, wait, I'm in a distressing situation here. I am really prone to make up a story right now that makes me look good. At least vis-a-vis you. And it's in the pause that I can say, wait, no, I'm not going to do that. Let's wait and see how this works out. I'd like to know how you were feeling, how you saw it. I'm going to withhold judgment. So, I say these are precursors to functioning at the parent level of maturity. Because I don't see how you function like a parent And what parents do is seek the well-being of children at personal cost. I don't see how you do that if you don't stay fundamentally at a high joy state and you're not able to pause and say, what's really going on with me? Our freedom really exists in the pause. When I don't necessarily go with the automatic explanation that my brain gives me, or the automatic motivations or response patterns that my brain gives me. Freedom exists really in the 0.2 seconds from the time I become aware that I'm responding in a certain way and before I move into a definite course of action. When I can say, wait, let's move in the direction of love, joy, and peace rather than in the direction of selfishness, anger, frustration, control, bitterness, or what have you. This leads me to, I'm going to take a short excursus here, and let's call it an excursus on sin. Because most of what I've been talking about here in the last 2 weeks has been in terms of psychosocial maturity rather than spiritual maturity, and I've been talking more in using categories from neuroscience and psychological resources and research. But there is a good old-fashioned term that I think is helpful. And that term is sin. And I think, someone was asking me, because I do think most social commentators will say that we're as a culture, we're in a very different state than we were 50 years ago. That the whole system is on a whole lot more level of psychosocial distress. 26-year-olds just aren't by and large functioning like they did 50 years ago, in the sense that they aren't functioning like adults. I mean, 50 years, the typical 16-year-old 50 years ago was, by any hard measure, more psychosocially mature than the typical 26-year-old is today. And so one of the questions that I've been pondering is why the difference? I mean, you talk to someone like Jane Cox, who taught here for the first 8 years of Ambleside's existence. She was a first grade teacher. Well, she started teaching in the early 60s. And so she taught for over 40 years, 45 years. And she'll tell you that it's a very different world now than it was in the early 60s in terms of the way children behaved, the kinds of pressures, the kind of social and psychological structures that were in place. And so one of the things we ask is, what happened? And I think one of the mistakes we've made is that we've forgotten that children are sinners and that we're sinners. And part of the reason for that might have been we got so carried away with the emphasis 100 years ago that they were sinners that we forgot that they were really beloved, unique creations of God, precious and beautiful, with immense potential. And they are all that. They are created in the image of God and precious with all potential and great capacity, but they're also sinners. And so I think we kind of, the pendulum went from one to the other. But if I begin now as an adult, and this is the standard I have for myself, and Lord knows I fall short. But to the extent that I can maintain a consistently highly mature stance It is only because I am very rigorous with myself. And I personally consider any response that comes forth from me, any reaction that I might have, that's less than love, joy, and peace. I mean, and it really doesn't matter what you're doing. I mean, if you're coming into my office raging, upset, breaking my furniture, as far as I'm concerned, what you should get back from me is love, joy, and peace. And if you don't, well, you may have your problem, but that's my problem. And I think so much of what we have done as a culture is to scientifically reduce everything to the average, and then the average keeps dropping. By that I mean, if most people, if you are unkind to me, and most people would then get angry at you for being unkind to me, I then justify my own anger because I look around and say, that's what everybody else would do. That's normal. Therefore, you deserve my anger. And I have a right to be angry. I rather think that line of thought has been a great mistake. Because it then justifies anger and the developing of the neural pathways associated with anger. Every time we engage in a behavior, we develop our brain in a certain direction. We reinforce certain brain structures. So every time I allow myself to move in anger, I become more of an angry man. Every time I allow myself to move in selfishness, I become more of a selfish man. Footnote, that's why pornography is so destructive. Because, frankly, when every time a 15-year-old, a 25, 35, 55-year-old man or woman, but principally men, looks at pornography, their brain gets restructured around that pornography. And their way of relating, the way their brain responds to women is altered. And the more pornography, the more entrenched that alteration is. And so you actually cultivate the brain of a pervert. You know, that's what we do changes our brain. It always matters. It always matters. There are no neutral actions. Because everything we do develops our brain and shapes our responses and our character. So because I don't want to be an angry man. I don't want to be a bitter man. I don't want to be a selfish man. That is not what I want to be. I cannot give myself the luxury of justifying those responses, even if those responses are just internally, because even the mere internal response is restructuring my brain in that direction. And I get enough internal responses, my brain gets structured along those lines, I won't long be able to keep it as just an internal response. So, if I want to be a kind man, a gracious man, a loving man, a supportive man, I can give no space in my responses for anger, bitterness, self-justification. I have to, using the old-fashioned term, call it sin. And then, using another old-fashioned term, repent of it and just turn in a different direction. Say, I got 0.2 seconds before I move. I'm going to redirect here. God, my response to what they're doing right now is anger, frustration. I want to punch their lights out, though I won't do it because that would look bad, and I'm too narcissistic to allow myself to look bad. So I won't do that. No. That doesn't change anything. I want to move in a completely different direction and not respond in anger. Lord of mercy, Christ of mercy, Lord of mercy. Now, and I think because somehow we stopped being rigorous with ourselves and got into the habit of justifying our negative, destructive reactions, we as a culture have gone downhill because the average keeps dropping. If you make the average the norm, the average will always drop. Whether it's mathematics or kindness or standard for kindness. Make the average the norm, the average will always drop. So that's my little excursus on sin, because if we're going to be mature parents, I don't see how we get there without being rigorous with ourselves. Merciful too. Merciful in the sense that toxic shame, beating yourself up, never helped anybody. Merciful in that I want to turn, these are my reactions. God, I'm thankful that there's forgiveness in the universe, but I do want to move in a different direction. And I absolutely refuse to justify. I will not say I have the right to be angry. She deserves my anger. He deserves my anger. I have the right to be selfish. I gave so much last week. I can be selfish now. I absolutely refuse to do that kind of self-justification. Only then do I think one can truly function at a parent level of maturity. Because frankly, the most fundamental thing about being a parent is taking care of someone else who really can't do much for you. At least other than be a sheer delight because you love them. And so being a parent requires that we get over ourselves. I just don't see how you do parenting well without that. I don't see how you stay selfish or stay angry or stay bitter and parent well. Just can't see how you do it. Now, that's not to say we won't all have our moments of bitterness, anger, selfishness. But it's very different between justifying it and moving the other direction. Oh, and one of the things we tell the teachers is a good save gets you more points than never having dropped the ball at all. So if I happened to have responded in anger, selfishness, bitterness, frustration, whatever it might be, if I go to a 5-year-old and say, do you know, I responded in anger there, and that's really not the kind of man your dad wants to be. And every once in a while we lose it. But I was wrong. That's not the kind of man I want to be. Would you forgive me? I tell you, Dad, do that to a 5-year-old? You get more credibility, more points, more status. Simply because you have integrity in their eyes and you're trustworthy. I mean, it's a huge mistake to pretend with children rather than to own our stuff and ask for their forgiveness. They actually are very, very ready to forgive. But they can't stand hypocrisy. I mean, children smell hypocrisy a mile away, and they just can't stand it. All right, so these are the precursors to parent and elder level maturity. Now, a few thoughts on what it means to be a parent, to function at that level of maturity. To function at a parent level of maturity is to protect, serve, and enjoy one's family. And notice all three are integral. Protect, serve, and enjoy. Some of us don't have the habit that we don't really know how to enjoy that well. Some of us don't have the habit of serving. All right. What do? We own our weakness and seek to move forward. What does service look like? Service means I see a need and I'm there. I see a need and I'm there. Now, sadly, I think, if I were to tell you the truth, that's one of my weaknesses. Mary Ellen would tell you that. I don't have eyes to see. I mean, the dishes could be piling up in the sink, and I just don't see them there. Now, if she asks me, I'll do them. But she'd really like me to strengthen that service muscle so that I would actually see the dishes. But it's a weakness. It's a weakness. To protect. Now, obviously, physically protect. But there's also an emotional, relational protection. That I am aware of my children's heart, and I guard their hearts. To do that, I've got to be aware. I've got to read their little faces. I've got to know what's going on with them. I just think of one girl. We were observing a class in one of the schools in South Africa, and a particular student was just all over the place. And one would have been tempted to see the child as rebellious until you heard the backstory. And I'm not going to tell you the backstory, but it wasn't pretty. And then you begin to think that maybe someone with this kind of emotional turmoil in their life really would find it hard to sit still. And you might have a little bit more patience to protect that child's heart. Fathers, mothers, do you know your children's heart? And how do you protect their heart? Again, this goes back to that whole idea of mind sight. pausing, ask the question, what's going on here? Rather than just react according to our program. That's how we do most of life. Most of our life is done simply by reacting according to our programming. And that's where we get in trouble in relationships, because I'm reacting based on my programming and you're reacting based on your programming, and neither of us is really pausing to say, what's going on here? So you begin to see one of my key themes is it's the pause. It's the knowing our heart and the heart of the child. Only then can I protect a child's heart. One of the things about being a parent is we don't expect children to meet our needs. That is always pathological. Children are to be a blessing, and it's very important that their radar tells them that we delight in the child. One of the most difficult situations is to work with a person whom no one has ever delighted in. That's very hard to recover from. But there's a difference between us delighting in the child because of who they are and us seeking for the child to meet our needs. It is not a child's job to comfort us in our distress. That is not the child's job. And it is always hurtful to try to suck that kind of life out of a child. We serve them, they don't serve us. That's the job description. Doesn't mean we don't have them work. Chores are important. But they're working because it's in their best interest that they learn how to work. So they help with chores. They help clean up around the house. They have responsibilities. They carry part of the workload. But it's not because they're taking care of us. It's because it's good for them. To be a parent is to teach children how to return to joy from distressing events in life. There will always be the scraped knees. There will always be the scraped hearts. How do you recover from that? I can remember one of my precious memories is I was 4, and I was about to have my tonsils taken out. So I was in the hospital, which is kind of scary because they were going to put me under. And so I remember just asking my mother if she would hold me. So she picked me up and she held me. That was her helping me manage my emotional distress. On the other side of, it's not the child's job to take care of the parent's emotional distress. I remember playing Little League football. I must have been 12 years old, and our quarterback was a guy by the name of Frank Gasparovic. And Frank dropped back to pass, and the protection broke down, and he got hit from both sides at the same time. very hard and went down really hard, and he didn't get up. And here comes Mrs. Gasparovic running down onto the field. Of course, Frank was mortified, as were we all for him. And I remember sitting in the car immediately after the game with my brother Greg, who's a year younger than I, both of us sitting in the car and getting Mom's very direct attention, and then informing her that in no circumstances our arms could be torn from us and on separate ends of the field, but she was never to come down on the field. If we were hurt, she could ask Dad to go ask the coach if we were okay. But I remember this lecture that we gave my mother. Why? We didn't want her to embarrass us because she needed us to take care of her emotions. It's always the job of the parent to help the child deal with the child's emotions. It's never the job of the child to help the parent deal with the parent's emotions. Again, it's part of the job description. All right, so those, I think, are the basic attributes, responsibilities of someone functioning at a parent level of emotional, relational maturity. And just a few minutes, and then we'll finish up, and just to talk about elder level maturity. To be an elder in a community, and there are very few of them around, because to be an elder means I'm no longer just caring for my own family, and I'm beyond caring about myself. I give my life for the community. The role of the elder is to sacrificially care for the community. And generally, one enters into that role after your youngest child has become an adult. Sadly, our vision for becoming older is not that we become elders, it's that we return to adolescence. So very sadly, we have the typical 60-year-old who's now acting like a 16-year-old again. Rather than having grown into the level of maturity where he or she can now take the brokenness of the community and minister back grace and love and care to that community. To be an elder requires that one be able to emotionally, relationally absorb the pain of a community. And in every community there's pain. We can't live together in this broken world as broken people and not have pain in the community. What an elder does is takes the pain into himself and then dissipates it rather than spitting it back to the community. That's why one of the chief requirements for whoever would be principal here is that they be able to absorb emotional, relational distress and not spit it back into the community. That's what a leader or an elder of a community has to be able to do. And whether it's a church, a school, an organization, there's a wonderful book, one of the best business books you'll buy, Good to Great, by Jim Collins. And one of the first things he talks about is the difference between a level 5 and a level 4 leader. A level 4 leader is tremendously talented, but everything's about him. A level 5 leader is tremendously gifted, but self-effacing and self-sacrificing, and is always trying to move everybody else forward. And that's what makes a great That's one of the key attributes of a great company. A great school, a great church, a great family. So I told you before, and I'll finish with this, because I think this is the mark of a parent, and then as it grows into an elder. I've probably told you this before, but I'll end with this. One of the most amazing things I ever heard a man say was, I was 22, I had come home from college, I had walked into my parents' bedroom, and Dad was standing by the vanity, and he was shaving, and he had shaving cream on, and he was taking the shaving off. And I turned to my father, and I said, Dad, what's your vocation? What's your life about? And he stopped, he paused, he turned to me, and he said, to facilitate the ministry of my wife and children. That his whole life was about serving his wife and his children. That's why he could have 12 children, 20 foster children, have our house as a center of this extended relational ministry. That's why when he retired, you had hundreds of people come out to his retirement party. And you had people standing up and talking about. One guy stood up and he said, at these kinds of things, you're supposed to say something funny about the person who's retiring. He said, but I don't know anything funny to say about Bill St. Cyr. I said, my father's name's also Bill. He said, what I would say, though, is he is a profoundly good man. Wherever he goes, he helps. Now, that's the mark of a parent. It's the mark, even more, of an elder. But we don't get there without being absolutely rigorous with ourselves. Anything that's not of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control, I absolutely will not make an excuse for it. It is not my best self. It is not what I'm made to be. And even if you're acting like a crazy man or a crazy woman, it doesn't justify anything less than love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness from me. It just doesn't matter what you're doing. It doesn't justify my response. And I will be absolutely rigorous with myself. Not that I can stop it. Those reactions, they will be long in dying. But I'll tell the truth about them, and that's how over time I will develop new habits, new ways of responding. I will take the old-fashioned term and I will call them sin, and I will take the other old-fashioned term and I will repent and move in a different direction. And that is the only path to maturity that I can see. And it's what our children need. And it's what we need for ourselves. So, I'm sure it's time for you to get back to your children. But thanks for taking the time to come out tonight.